in the middle of Matthew chapter 14. We'll start in verse 13, if you want to turn there in your Bibles. So we've been trucking along through the Gospel of Matthew, and we come to the middle of chapter 14, and at this point in where we are in Matthew's Gospel, we're in a large chunk of narrative. And so if you recall, I've talked about it just about every class, how in Matthew he alternates between a big chunk of narrative, which is a story, which there's teachings in there as well, some of which we'll look at today, but then there's also big chunks of teaching. If you have a red letter Bible, in the big chunks of teaching, the whole section would be in red because it's just all the words of Jesus. And so we've looked at already three of the what's called the five major sources of teaching in Matthew. Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, as it's commonly called, that was the first one. And then we've looked at Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus commissions the 12. And then we looked at Matthew chapter 13, the parables of the kingdom. The next chunk of teaching is going to be in chapter 18. So we're kind of in this big chunk of narrative at this point, where you have chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17, leading up to this next big unit of teaching from Jesus that Matthew has for us. And so we're in this big chunk of narrative, and for the sake of continuity, we're going to try to keep the general flow of thought in mind as we go through this. And so to this point, starting in this portion of the narrative, what we've seen at the end of chapter 13, we see Jesus get rejected in his hometown. He's there in Nazareth, and he's rejected there. There's the famous expression that comes at the end of that where Jesus says, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household." That's actually going to come up when we go through this section here today. And then we looked last week of when John the Baptist was killed by Herod. He's beheaded. The daughter of Herodias wanted his head on a silver platter. We looked at that last week and so on. So we're going to go through the rest of this chapter kind of quickly. And so there's some details that we may not necessarily dive into a whole lot. I'll just briefly mention a few things. But in the rest of this chapter, Matthew chapter 14, there are three miracle stories that Matthew has for us. And the reason I call them miracle stories is there's two miracles that happen. There is the feeding of the 5,000, and then there's Jesus walking on water. And then there's sort of a general statement at the end of the chapter of these various healings that Jesus does in the town of Gennesaret. And so this is the section that we'll look at this morning. Lord willing, I get through all of my notes. So some things to look for in these miracle stories as we go through this, because remember, this is sort of a continuous train of thought that Matthew has for us. And so things to look for, obviously, what does this show us about Jesus? This should be on the forefront of our minds with every story in this gospel account. What does this tell us about Jesus? Because he's the focal point of these stories. So what does this show us about Jesus? Even looking back at the last one with John the Baptist when he's killed, that still tells us something about Jesus, because it tells us that Jesus is going to have the same fate as John. That was the big focal point of the story from last week. So we need to look at what this shows us about Jesus. The word for that is Christology. Then we look at what connections these miracles can have as well. Sometimes a miracle can take place, and maybe it's a source of typology or something that happened previously that perhaps looked ahead at this. Maybe it was something that was prophesied about. Maybe there's allusions from the Old Testament in reference to this. But then also sometimes it's looking ahead at something else. Maybe there's foreshadowing going on in various things. There's at least one aspect of that we'll look at today. And another thing, and this is something that comes up a lot in Matthew's gospel, I think Matthew's intentional with this, is showing us how others react to these miracles. Matthew, more so than the other gospel writers, is sure to highlight how people react to these miracles. He'll say they marveled. Or about the Pharisees, he'll say that they were conspiring and different things like that. And so there's a lot of reactions that we see, and how other people react can tell us a lot. It can tell us about those people. It can tell us about what Jesus is doing, so on and so forth. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and get into the first story here, the feeding of the 5,000. This is Matthew 14, starting in verse 13. It says, "Now when Jesus heard this," this is referring back to John the Baptist being killed. "When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' But Jesus said, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They said to him, 'We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children." So this is obviously a pretty extraordinary thing that happens. This is, of course, a miracle that Jesus does. And how we see this begin is kind of interesting. It begins with Jesus withdrawing to a desolate place. This is something we see Jesus do on occasion. Sometimes you just need to take a step back, and that's what Jesus is doing here. And what prompted Jesus to withdraw is the news of John's death. And so you can kind of see the segue that Matthew has from one story to the next. He tells of John's death, and in verse 12 it says, John's disciples came and took John and buried his body, and they went and told Jesus about it. And then it's that news that leads Jesus to withdraw. Jesus obviously knows what lies ahead of him. He knows that just as John did, Jesus is going to also be killed. But that time has not come yet. And so for now, Jesus withdraws. One thing that's interesting, you can look at in chapter 4 and verse 12, when Jesus initially gets word that John has been thrown in prison. That also leads to Jesus withdrawing. And so you see some parallels here perhaps with Jesus withdrawing on at least these 2 occasions with the news of something that's happened to John. One is with John being arrested. That's in chapter 4. Now here in chapter 14, John's been killed, and Jesus withdraws once again. And so he tries to go to a place of solitude. Have you ever wanted to just be alone and people keep coming and they keep bothering you? That can be irritating, can't it? Well, this is what happens to Jesus. He withdraws. He goes to a desolate place. Maybe I'm reading into it, but it seems like he wants to be by himself. You certainly see that after this miracle when he goes up on a mountain by himself. But Jesus withdraws, and crowds follow him. And this isn't a new thing either. The crowds have been following Jesus all throughout Matthew's gospel account, and they follow him once again here. And so it's interesting. Jesus, he withdraws by boat. He gets in a boat and he sails off. But evidently he didn't go too far away because the crowds are able to just walk around and find him that way. They follow him on foot. Well, one can't help but wonder, why is it that Jesus is being followed by these crowds? Especially in light of what we've just read in Matthew's account. You go back to the end of chapter 13, and they've just rejected Jesus in Nazareth. These are his own people. These are people that he knew, people that grew up with him, and they've rejected him. And so that should still be on the front of our minds. Jesus has just been rejected, and now we've seen a foreshadowing of the fact that they're going to kill Jesus. That's what John's death does for us. It shows us what's going to happen. So why are they following him? Well, keep in mind what we read in chapter 13 and verse 57, where it says, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his household." This tells us a couple things. On the one hand, it tells us that he doesn't have honor in his hometown. We see that with the rejection. But it also shows us that when he's not with his own people, he has honor. A prophet does have honor. And so this is the crowd that's been following Jesus, and they've been following him around for a while, and they continue to follow him. His own people from Nazareth have rejected him, but you still have these other people that are wanting a piece of what Jesus offers. And so he's not without honor. That double negative means that he has honor. And so this crowd comes and they are following Jesus. And we see here that Jesus, once again, has compassion on this crowd. He's had compassion on crowds before, and we see it here once again. And so the compassion of Jesus is something that we see drawn out multiple times as Matthew has been recording these things for us. That compassion will ultimately be seen with Jesus going to the cross. And so Jesus' compassion here in verse 14, it prompts him to heal their sick. And so this is something, again, Jesus does multiple times. He heals the sick. He casts out demons. He does all of these extraordinary things. And this is, again, no exception. And so he heals their sick. And this compassion is also going to prompt the miracle that's coming. Jesus healing their sick is a miraculous thing, but that's not the miracle that we're focusing on at this moment. He's going to feed a multitude of people. That miracle also stems from the compassion that Jesus has on this crowd. And what's interesting is you can almost see a little bit of a contrast drawing up here between Jesus and his disciples. One thing that is going to begin to start happening is the disciples are going to start to make fools of themselves. This leads ultimately to when Jesus is arrested and they scatter, which that's the fulfillment of prophecy. We'll get to that eventually. But we start to begin to see some shortcomings from the disciples. For example, we'll see in chapter 16, after Peter makes the proclamation, "You're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God," immediately after that, Jesus tells them about how he's going to have to go and suffer these things at Jerusalem and be handed over, and then he's going to be killed. That's where Peter says, that ain't going to happen. That's, of course, when Jesus rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan," and so on. And so we're going to start to see a lot of the shortcomings by the disciples. And this can kind of seem like an instance of that, maybe the beginnings of that, because what happens here, Jesus is having compassion on the crowd, but the disciples want to send the crowd away. We see that in verse 15. We see it's evening, and we see the disciples come and say, "This is a desolate place," and what that means is they're in the middle of nowhere, they're in some podunk area, there's no stores around, there's nowhere they can go quickly to get food. So they say, "This is a desolate place, the day is now over, send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." And so they're in a desolate place, meaning there's no convenient place to go and get food. It's not like in some towns, every small town in America, it seems like, has a Dollar General at least. If not a McDonald's or something like that. My grandparents and my aunt, they lived in the small town of Mansalona. My aunt actually lived in the village of Mansalona. When it's a village, that's how you know it's small. And even they had a McDonald's and they had a grocery store and so on and so forth. Well, it wasn't like that back then. There weren't Dollar Generals popping up all around like there are now. They're in a desolate place. There's no convenient place for them to go and get food. And you can kind of see where the disciples are coming from. On the one hand, you could see them perhaps being a little rude. They want to send the people away. And you can especially see that in contrast with Jesus. But on the other hand, if anything, they're just being practical. Maybe it's a lack of faith on their part. In fact, it is a lack of faith, I would say. But they're being practical here. They're being a little short-sighted, but it's practical. There's no food around here. There's nowhere to get food. We need to just send these people away so they don't starve to death. Well, they want to send the crowds away, but Jesus, he's not into that idea because of the compassion that he's having for them. And there's something really funny in this. Notice how Jesus turns this on his disciples. You give them something to eat. He pins this on them. You give them something. Well, the problem is they don't have enough food. They say, "We've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. This isn't enough to feed this multitude of people." At the end, we see it's 5,000 men, yet alone the women and children that are there. Several thousand people are here, and they don't have nearly enough food. So you see the problem. There's these people here, they've been with them all day. They're probably getting hungry, they're probably getting cranky, hangry as they like to call it nowadays. So what do? Well, the disciples want to send these people away. Jesus is not into that idea, And so Jesus, when it becomes evident that the disciples aren't going to do anything, Jesus takes matters into his own hands. We see in verse 18, he says, "Bring them here to me." And so he takes these 5 loaves and these 2 fish, and he has the crowd sit, and he performs this miracle. Something interesting we see here, and this is going to come up in a minute. Jesus tells the crowd to sit down. That's a weird detail that Matthew gives us, but I think he's intentional. The word that's used in the Greek language that is translated in the English Standard, the version I'm reading from, to sit down, that word is the same word that's commonly used in the New Testament to refer to reclining at table. That's the same word, and that's used a lot of times in fellowship settings. Reclining at table, that is a very intimate sort of fellowship that the Jews had at that time, and this is the same word that's used here. So you see, Jesus, he's sort of giving them an intimate experience here. They're sitting down on this grass. We see that he blessed and broke the loaves, and again, he has the disciples distribute them. It would be a while if Jesus was the one distributing this food, so he has the 12 distribute it. And what we see happen here is, despite there being just 5 loaves and 2 fish, the crowds ate and were satisfied. And so the crowds have their fill. It's not like sometimes you go to a party and there's not enough food, so you got to kind of eat like half a portion. It's not like that. They're able to eat as much as they want, and not only that, but they have an abundance left over. It mentions here that they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces that are left over. So they have enough for 5,000 people and then some. So he feeds over 5,000 people, 5,000 men, yet alone the women and children. That's perhaps close to 10,000 people that Jesus ends up feeding. So Jesus performs this miracle. He feeds a multitude of people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish. So what does this miracle teach us? Well, one thing, like we saw at the beginning, is Jesus' compassion compels him to act. He has compassion on the crowd. The disciples seem rather callous in comparison. They want to send the crowds away. Jesus says, "No, bring them to me," and he feeds them. And we're going to ultimately see this compassion of Christ fulfilled when he goes to the cross, because of the compassion that he has for the people that were there and the compassion that he has for all of us. He went to that cross and suffered mightily and died for us. And so this is perhaps a sign of what is to come. Another thing, Jesus' displays power here to meet people's physical needs. And you can see a lot of different examples of this. You can look in John chapter 2 when he turns the water to wine. You could look in John chapter 21, so on and so forth. Another thing here, there are some parallels from the Old Testament. You can look in 1 Kings 17, 2 Kings chapter 4 as well. And there's some parallels here with miraculous feedings of people. If you look just, for example, in 2 Kings chapter 4, I'll look at that example. Starting in verse 1, this is about Elisha. It says, "The wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord. But the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be slaves.' And Elisha said to her, 'What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house?' She said, 'Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil.' He said, 'Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons, and pour into all these vessels. When one is full, set it aside.' So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. And when the vessels were full, she said to her son, 'Bring me another vessel.' And he said to her, 'There is not another.' Then the oil stopped flowing." So you see how you can have a little bit and it can meet a big need. That's an example of that. If you look in later in verses 42 through 44 of this same chapter, there's another story with Elisha. It says, a man came from Baal Shalishah, I think is how you pronounce that, bringing the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, give to the men that they may eat. But his servant said, how can I set this before 100 men? So he repeated, give them to the men that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left. Some attribute what happens here in 2 Kings chapter 4. Some say that what happens here with the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, that fulfills this, and this is perhaps another prophecy that's fulfilled. And you have this quotation, they shall eat and have some left. That's in 2 Kings 4 and verse 43. So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left, according to the word of the Lord. So that's just a couple of examples. You could look at 1 Kings 17 as well, and you can see some parallels here with the Old Testament. This was something that Matthew's immediate audience would have known. Another thing that's really interesting, this is something that some commentators point out that I had never thought of, at least not reading it in Matthew's account. I've thought of it before reading it in John, where there's perhaps some possible foreshadowing going on pertaining to the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper being, of course, the memorial that we take every Sunday, as they did, right? And you have the unleavened bread, you have the fruit of the vine. It is reminiscent of Jesus' broken body and Jesus shed blood, so on and so forth. One thing that's really interesting, when you compare Matthew 14 with Matthew 26, which is when Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, they're structured nearly identically. For example, in both instances, it's evening. Both mention reclining. In this verse, it's sitting, but it's the same word that's used, sitting on grass, reclining at table. In both examples, Jesus took bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and then he gave it. And so there's some parallels here. So is this a coincidence, or is there something more going on? Perhaps in Matthew it might seem coincidental, but when you compare it to this same story happening in John's gospel account with some of the things that Jesus teaches right after, it seems like there might be some foreshadowing going on here. This is what Jesus says afterward in John's account. This is coming from John 6, verses 53 and 54. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him on the last day. Some say this in John 6 is Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper. I don't know that I would go as far as saying that, because it's not explicitly what he says. But you can see some, perhaps a weird coincidence, if not some foreshadowing going on here between what Matthew talks about and what the parallels leading up to the institution of the Lord's Supper and then what Jesus teaches in John 6. Are there any comments on any of that? Garfield?
About he providing for their physical needs. You take, the Bible says when the children of Israel left Egypt, there were 600,000 men besides women and children. So you probably got maybe 1 million or 2 million people or more. And God fed them for 40 years in the wilderness manna. And when they complained, he fed them some meat, some quail meat.
Yeah, so that's another parallel. Garfield mentions what happened in Exodus when God met their physical needs, feeding them with the manna and the quail and so on. There's another allusion back to Moses. A lot of parallels between Jesus and Moses as well. And Jesus makes that comparison in John 6 as well. Yeah, that's a long time. Yes?
I'm just wondering how anyone could come to the conclusion there were 5,000 men. I mean, was somebody appointed to counter? I mean,
Yeah.
how do they know there were 5,000?
That's an interesting question. How do they know it was 5,000? Someone must have counted. I don't know. We have a designated counter, usually. Of course, it's easier to count 80 people instead of several thousand. I don't know if someone counted it or if it was divinely revealed or what have you, but it's a lot of people regardless. All right, so the next miracle is when Jesus walks on the water. And this is a pretty well-known miracle that Jesus performs. One thing that's interesting that Matthew has for us is the fact that Peter also does this. We'll read that here. So this is Matthew 14, starting in verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, there's a footnote in my Bible that says between 3 and 6 a.m., being that particular period of time. In the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "You have little doubt. Why you have little faith? Why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So this is a really neat miracle. On the one hand, Jesus does something quite extraordinary, but then on the other hand, you have one of the disciples also doing it, at least for a period. Things seem to be kind of chaotic at the beginning. You see in verse 22 that this is an immediate thing where it's not a lot of time in between. They're doing things kind of fast. It almost seems like they're flying by the seat of their pants. And we see that he made the disciples get into the boat. And so I don't know if maybe Jesus is just in a hurry, or if maybe the disciples were just being a little lackadaisical, or what have you. But he makes them get in this boat. They go to the other side. Jesus goes up on the mountain. And so it makes you wonder, what is the urgency here? It seems like they're moving quickly. It seems like they're kind of in a rush. So why the urgency? Well, when you compare this again with how John puts things, perhaps we get a little bit of a clue as to what's going on. Matthew leaves some of this out, but John, in his account, gives us some more insight as to perhaps what's going on. And again, think about what we read at the end of chapter 13. A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, so on and so forth. So keep that in mind as we read this. When the people saw the sign that he had done, this is the feeding of the 5,000, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And so we see in John's account of how things happen, the people are amazed at what Jesus has done. Later on in John, we figure out it's just because they had their bellies fed and nothing much more than that. But they're amazed by what's happened, and they're ready to make Jesus their king by force. They're ready to get things going in terms of going against Rome and so on and so forth. Well, remember, Jesus is not that kind of king. His kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, as he says later on in John when he's talking to Pilate. And so he can't let this happen. And so perhaps that's why there seems to be a sense of urgency here as Matthew is portraying this happening. And so for a moment, Jesus and his disciples separate. They don't separate very often, but here's a moment where they do. The disciples go ahead. They're in the boat. They're going over to the other side. Jesus goes up on this mountain by himself. He's finally able to withdraw. He's finally able to get some peace and quiet and pray to himself for a period. And we see once again, while the disciples are separated from Jesus, they're once again in a storm. This makes you think of Matthew chapter 8, where they're in a storm. In that example, Jesus is sleeping in the boat. They wake him up. He calms the storm. He rebukes them because of their lack of faith, so on and so forth. And so this makes you think of what happened back in Matthew chapter 8. But there's one key difference. Now the disciples are alone. And so now they're really being tested. Because they don't have Jesus asleep in the boat. They don't have him to go and wake up. Which, by the way, is really rude. Don't wake up people when they're taking a nap. But now they're alone, and they don't have Jesus there. And so now for at least a moment, they have to weather this storm on their own. Well, eventually Jesus catches up to them, and he does so by walking on the water. If he had to get in a boat, it would have taken some time. But he's able to just walk out to them. And so he walks on the water to them. And we see again this happens in the fourth watch of the night. This is likely between 3 and 6 in the morning, so it's early morning. The sun perhaps hasn't risen yet. Perhaps it's dark. We know that they're in a storm. And so given these circumstances, the winds are beating against them. They're in the midst of this storm. And then you just see someone walking on the water. We see that the disciples were terrified when they saw Jesus. They are filled with terror at this. And can you blame them? We can kind of see some of the shortcomings, but some of their shortcomings are a little bit relatable. Perhaps some of their shortcomings are some of ours as well. And so they cry out, "It is a ghost," in verse 26. And they cry out in fear. But then Jesus reassures them in verse 27 when he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Some of your versions, instead of "take heart," it says, "have courage," or something along those lines. And again, can we blame the disciples for being afraid? We could point the finger at them and we know that that's wrong. But truth be told, we probably would be just as afraid, if not worse. I think I would be. I don't like being on the water already. So if I'm in the middle of a storm and there's just a dude standing out there, I would probably be a little scared too. But notice immediately, at least with Peter, he goes from being afraid and terrified to being kind of emboldened, which is typical for Peter. And he tries to walk on the water. And so he prompts Jesus by saying, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." I don't know what is in Peter's mind that would make him want to do this, but he wants to do it. And Jesus humors him and says, "Come." And what's really interesting is Peter is actually initially successful. It says Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. So Peter also walks on the water. This is really quite a situation that we have here. But eventually, he sinks. Verse 30, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me.'" You would not want to be out in the water in the middle of this storm. Not in a boat, but actually in the water. You wouldn't want to be out there. It'd be an easy chance for someone to drown. And so he's initially successful in walking on the water, but then he sees the waves and he loses faith. And we can say that he loses faith because of what Jesus says when he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" So Jesus does save Peter, but then he rebukes his lack of faith. And then notice the response of the disciples. Especially notice this in comparison with Matthew chapter 8. And so there's the previous sea miracle, that we'll call it, when Jesus calms the storm. And they marvel and they ask the question, "What sort of man is this?" That's from Matthew 8 and verse 27. They don't know what kind of a person Jesus is at this point. They have a general idea, but they're still left marveling. They're dumbfounded at how this can be. Well, now in chapter 14, they answer their own question. What sort of man is this? Truly, you are the Son of God. They can answer their own question. We can see some growth in these disciples, even though they still get it wrong occasionally. So what does this miracle teach us? One thing it shows us, again, Jesus is able to show authority over natural law. And there's a lot that is going on behind the scenes here. Some of this I don't understand, to be frank with you. But there's things like gravity. Gravity would have you sink to the bottom. Jesus defies that. There's physics that are being defied here. so on and so forth. But another thing that's really interesting to think about, walking on water has some pretty strong allusions back at the Old Testament. And again, this is something Matthew's initial audience probably would have had some understanding about, because they would have been devout Jews. They would have known their Old Testament, not like we know it. We don't know it hardly at all. And so some examples that you have are in Job 9 and verse 8, also in Habakkuk 3 and 15, and in Psalm 77 and verse 19. In particular, Psalm 77 is a really interesting one. It says in Psalm 77 and verse 19, your way was through the sea. And you can see they're initially talking about the Red Sea, and that's perhaps some of the illusion that's going on here, because they are able to walk through the Red Sea on dry land. So in a way, the people of Israel walked not on water, but through water. And it says in Psalm 77, your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Think also about Habakkuk 3 and verse 15, where it says, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. So Habakkuk here says that the Lord tramples the sea. Trampling would be to walk on it, right? And then Job 9 and verse 8, he's talking about the Lord, and it says, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. So this is something that has some strong allusions back in the Old Testament. This is something that would defy logic. It defies the laws of nature. And it's something that only God can do. Peter does it with God, but this is something that only God can do. One commentator put it this way. This is Davies and Allison, I believe, where it says, Yahweh, the omnipotent creator, treads upon the waters. That's what the Old Testament shows us. Jesus is showing us that he is the omnipotent one, the creator who can also tread upon the waters. Any comments on that before we go to the next one? The next one's really quick, so we have a minute or two. Dolly?
That Peter had a lot of faith in order to get out of the boat and go to Jesus in the first place. He must have had faith that it was Jesus that he was speaking to. Last summer when I went ziplining, I stood on the platform, and before I jumped, I was afraid. It took me a minute to jump off that platform, but I finally came to my mind that millions of other people have jumped off that platform and they made it to the other end safely. And so I had the faith that I would make it to the other end, and then I jumped. And so I'm thinking in the same, Peter had faith that was Jesus. Otherwise, he would not have gotten out of that boat.
It certainly would have taken some faith to get out of the boat, but then that faith went away when he saw the waves, and then he started sinking. So it certainly took some faith to do that. Absolutely.
Helped to strengthen their faith for the disciples. And it also created an awe. It displays that in the presence of God, there's awe and there's reverence and worthiness of being worshipped. And that's evident there. And you think about Matthew, and some of these you've already went through. Matthew mentions this phrase, you of little faith, so often, And again, it's mentioned here. But he said, you went over that. You of little faith in chapter 6 and chapter 8. Why are you afraid, you of little faith? Remember? Yeah. And then chapter 16 coming up, he says, you of little faith again. And then 17, because of your little faith. So there's that constant phrase being repeated. That's the constant theme of faith that's being repeated in Matthew. And these are definitely God miracles, and which are the only place where miracles come from. And I think that I lost my track of thought, but anyways, I don't want to take up your time in your last miracle, but it's important to keep that all in mind, because you saw the differences in John and Matthew. They have a different, goal. it seems like, in their verses of what they're trying to point out.
Yeah. I think of the class you taught on the miracles, and you think of what some of the purposes of these miracles are. One of the things is just to cement the faith of these men that are there. And we can kind of see they have some faith, but it's not all the way there yet. They still have some shortcomings. That's why they're still, you of little faith. When we get to the book of Acts, when the Spirit comes upon them, you see a big change in these same people, including Peter. And they go from perhaps kind of cowardly, especially when you look at the end of the gospel, when they scatter and when Peter betrays Jesus and so on. But then they get the Spirit, and that changes everything. Then they pray for boldness, right? In Acts, they have that boldness, and they truck along afterward. Yeah.
We have to remember that what Jesus' mission was, is he was teaching them in parables and his words, and everything was confirmed in that, and the miracles confirmed the word also. So he's creating faith all along this way through his teachings and through the miracles.
Yeah. Yeah, the things that Jesus taught, and now the things that he's doing, the things that he did, cemented what he taught. It gives credibility. It shows his authority to say he really is who he said he was. The things that he's teaching, these are right things. All right, let's quickly look at verses 34 through 36. It says, when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. When the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. So now eventually they cross to the other side, and they land in this place called Gennesaret. And scholars don't know where this place is. It's kind of funny that they're smart ones. They don't know where this place is. But they have a few ideas, but they don't know for sure. One thing about this miracle story is it is short and sweet. It's only a few verses long. It doesn't tell any names. It doesn't have any specific people. There's no specific stories. It's just sort of a summary statement that Matthew has for us here. But there's still a few details to make mention of as you look at this. One thing is the men of this place, they recognized Jesus. It says that they recognized him, and so they knew who he was. His fame has spread throughout the whole area. And by recognize, I don't think it necessarily means that they had seen him once before and they recognized him based on his looks. I think it means, oh, this is the Jesus that we've heard so much about. And so now they recognize him and they bring to him all who are sick. You can see the inclusivity of the fact that it's not just some people, but it's everyone. They bring everyone who are sick. All means all. And notice that they don't ask for much. They're not asking, of course, they are asking for a miracle. But all they want is just to be able to touch his garment. They touched that garment, and all who touched it were made well. Which is really quite an interesting thing to look at here. So one thing to look just sort of in summary, looking at these miracles, one thing you could look at, you can see, and I don't know if this is Matthew's intention, but there's some things you can garnish from this that could have allegorical interpretations that you could take and apply to our own lives. And by allegorical, what I mean by that is it can be sort of a symbol of something that applies to us. So you can look, for example, of how the people, they are sustained by Jesus. They're physically sustained. Jesus sustains us not just physically, but spiritually especially. So you can see that with his body and with his blood pertaining to the Lord's Supper, so on and so forth. Another thing, when you look at what happens to Peter, sometimes we're walking along, and sometimes we lose faith and we start sinking. We see that happen with Peter. Sometimes we can see that happen with ourselves as well. Sometimes we take our eyes off of Jesus and we sink. And we see finally, those that seek after Jesus, they can be made well by Jesus. Not necessarily in a physical sense, but especially in a spiritual sense. Because Jesus does give us that forgiveness of sins through his sacrifice. That's all I have this morning. Thanks for your time.